Once upon a time, there was unity behind whiteness. But somehow, in some way, all that began to fall apart under the pressure of black expansion into the inner city. We're talking specifically the 1950s and 60s time period, where many whites would flee based on the I instead of we. We continue with from the 2005 book, White Flight by Dr. Kevin Kruse. Integrity. The experiences of several white working-class neighborhoods in Atlanta demonstrate that community was an ideal that was regularly celebrated, but rarely experienced, meaning in words they acted as if they were really about community life. But in deeds, their real life hardly reflected that, as we'll see once that pressure builds. As these studies demonstrate, the concept of a white community was anything but a simple matter in struggles over race and residence. What's the concept of white community? That means the mental image they had created for themselves and held in the world of imagination. Human communities are both imagined and acted out on the physical plane of reality. But what was imagined about the white community wasn't always so clear once Negroes started moving closer into the neighborhood. The working class whites who lived in transition areas assumed that they and their neighbors shared not only the common traits of race and class, but also common interest in preserving segregation in their neighborhood and the status quo in local politics. Pay attention. During the course of residential desegregation, however, they discovered that their supposed common ground on these issues and identities was ultimately less important for them and their neighbors than each one's self-interest. They discovered that the I was more important than the we. This is where the entity known as individualism found its opportunity to emerge front and center in these white communities. And through the examples that they set, most Negroes would also later learn to follow along. But let's get some more on this self-interest being. As long as individual homeowners felt that their individual needs, protecting property values and maintaining a stable home, could be met by working with their neighbors, they did so. But watch this. Invariably, though, when some whites decided that their needs and the neighborhoods diverged, they resolved to act on their own and in their own self-interest, regardless of the repercussions. They didn't care if their actions threw the entire white community under the bus, as long as they looked out for their own self-interest in the process. The reality of individuality, these whites quickly realized, would always trump the rhetoric of community. This is how this entity trains the mind to think, once it has been allowed to take a high position in the human kingdom. And you see it all around us today in America, where this entity has emerged high within the culture. And it entered the society heavily through these types of white communities. And so, during the course of residential desegregation, as more and more working-class white Atlantans made this discovery, they thought of themselves less and less as participants in a larger society, with the attendant rights and responsibilities. It was catching on like wildfire. For them, connections to other whites on the same street, in the same neighborhood, or in the city at large had been proved pointless. Instead of thinking in terms of their supposed community, these working-class whites now started to think of themselves as individuals, set apart from, and indeed, set against the rest of Atlanta. Now, whites weren't extreme with individualism before, especially in the slavery days. But that's when the concept of whiteness was at its peak. But at this point here in the 1950s and 60s, whiteness was already on the decline and had already lost a lot of its value, since blacks were gaining a lot of the privileges that were originally only preserved for whites, like voting and being able to move freely into different areas. So the whites at this time were subtly questioning this community thing and concluding that it was best for them to consider the I before the we. Okay? So now that we have a little bit of the backdrop on what was changing during the time, Let's see how this played out in one of the white Atlanta communities. Situated in southeast Atlanta, Kirkwood was a white working-class neighborhood of long standing. Surveys from 1957 showed that more than 3/4 of its residents had lived on the same block for more than 5 years, although many had been there much longer, some since the 1910s. As in Adamsville, many of the residents not only lived together, but worked together too. So this was supposed to be a real deal community, right? One that checked all the boxes on paper. But something happened that created a change in the atmosphere. The whites of Kirkwood watched these black enclaves nervously, waiting for any signs of encroachment. Negroes were coming into a neighborhood near you, and whites were on it, locked in like a gazelle when it thinks that a predator is around. In 1954, when blacks began looking at homes in the eastern half of Kirkwood, a region known as Moreland Heights, whites sounded the alarm. Here we go.
An attempt is being made to sell white property to Negroes,
warned the Moreland Heights Civic Club.
We believe that those white people attempting to sell to Negroes have failed their responsibility as homeowners and neighbors.
They had turned their back on the white community. They broke the code that they knew they weren't supposed to break. And by doing so, they threw the entire community under the front bumper of the yellow bus. The sellers most definitely knew that they weren't supposed to do that, but they did it anyway. Now listen to what this secretary wrote to the mayor.
We have lived in this section for many years and own our homes, and we certainly don't want to be surrounded by Negroes.
That was the golden rule, and the people who sold their homes to Negroes were in major violation of it. And it wasn't even the homes that were the only thing in jeopardy. Pay attention.
We also have our churches near us and don't want them to be taken over by Negroes.
And we know if Negroes moved into a community and it had a church, you better believe it would be utilized. Now listen to this next man's complaint.
If we are forced out, we will lose our church and school. And we can't afford to do that.
Then don't sell and you don't have to worry about it. Right? It's a simple solution for a real community that operates collectively, but impossible to do with individually minded people who seek to put themselves before the whole. Now listen to the concern of this mechanic about the situation.
I have 3 girls, and I would not want them walking to and from school through Negro settlers on this street.
This stuff is serious. Although such ties to schools were limited, the bonds to area churches were quite strong. When asked,
"Do you attend church in this neighborhood?"
more than 70% said yes, pointing to one of the many Protestant churches in the area. For congregationally controlled churches like these, neighborhood concerns were church concerns. Not only did the congregations live in contested areas, in almost all cases, their pastors did too. Keeping Moreland Heights white was, therefore, both a pastoral and personal activity for many ministers. Where is that in the Bible? What chapter and verse states that it was the pastor's job to keep the community white? What happened to everyone holding hands with Jesus? For instance, the minister of Southeast Christian, a church of friendly Christians, urged his congregation to discuss the housing problem with WSMDC officials, but it was too late. Why was it too late? The rush to sell was on, and the neighborhood underwent swift racial succession. Come on with it. By 1960, 3/4 of the homes in Moreland Heights were occupied by blacks. Too many people who identified as white sold out, and it created a ripple effect. That's how most of this community transitioned so quickly. Just as WSMDC planners and local residents had feared, the churches were wiped out by the racial transition. Negroes all up in the pulpit, banging on tambourines. The First Church of the Nazarene and Southeast Christian both sold their buildings to black buyers and fled the neighborhood with their congregations. Gone. The Whiteford Baptist Church and an Evangelical Christian Fellowship Center closed their doors as well, moving miles to the east, beyond the transition troubles. Gone. And as far as city planners could tell, Bethany Primitive Baptist just disappeared. The members left so fast that they appeared to have been raptured. For many of these congregations, relocation was a financial nightmare. McKendree Methodist Church, for example, claimed an investment of $120,000 in its Moreland Heights property, but hoped to recoup just half that amount after its relocation. Racial transition, by their accounts, proved costly. But even with the high cost and inconvenience, that still outweighed the stigma of living in a black community, and that's why they left. As the course of black expansion continued toward the heart of Kirkwood, whites eyed the changes with alarm.
We have enjoyed our modest homes. Now, a vast flood of Negroes are coming eastward and threaten to swamp the area.
That was from 1960. The way he described it made it sound like they were being invaded by a foreign country. The Negroes are coming eastward, as if it were like a military war zone, right? This stuff is wild. Just as significantly, whites in this apparently united community also directed their anger and violence at their fellow whites. This intra-white hostility stemmed from the fact that whites responded to residential transition in very different ways. When confronted with the fact, not simply the threat, of black homeowners in their neighborhoods, whites reacted according to their proximity to racial change. Almost without exception, those nearest the front lines of transition wanted to flee, while those further back wanted to fight. I mean, in reality, this is a war zone. But it's a war zone with entity against entity in the city streets. The suppression versus the liberation entity. And those whites on the front line had to flee once the fire got too hot. And that exposed the cracks in unity within that community. The inherent conflict in those two goals soon surfaced, and a supposedly solid community succumbed to bitter infighting. On one side, whites who wanted to sell their homes blamed the others for holding them back. Observe.
A few diehards are attempting to interfere with legitimate transactions between homeowners and honest real estate salesmen. Many homeowners have suffered lost sales because of rabble-rousers.
Those on the front lines of the transition resented the interference of those further back.
From all the discussions I've heard,
A plumber wrote,
all of the hell being raised is mostly by people not directly concerned.
They do not want to live next to colored people,
fumed another man.
but they want us to. I feel that if they want to control my house, they should buy it themselves. I will be happy to sell it to any of these people who are nailing up the white area signs.
It's breaking down, people. The cracks were exposed under pressure. Frontline individuals didn't want to feel like frontline soldiers. They didn't want to take one for the team. And from an individualistic perspective, they were in every right to do exactly what they did. From a person who doesn't care about the community and doesn't think the community cares about them either, they had every right to do what they did. Now here's the other side of the story. At the same time, those hoping to stay accused their fleeing neighbors of betraying the community, which from a community perspective, that's exactly what they did. They broke the code. Many spoke of Kirkwood as the only neighborhood they had ever known. Several cited hardships of age or infirmity, which made it impossible for them to move, while others feared financial losses. The elderly with crutches and in wheelchairs got left behind with Negroes. The sick got left behind with Negroes. All because a few frontline whites wanted to look out for themselves and their own interest. Those who wanted to stay blamed their neighbors for undermining their collective security.
How unfair can things get? When you put all you can make and scrap to try and have a home, then some few who have money and can do better sell you out.
I know that's right. Because that's not the only group where members got some money and sold out the community. Once individual whites decided to abandon the community, or worse, turned against each other and proved that community had been an illusion all along, there was nothing community institutions could do to stop white flight. And if you thought it went down in this community, wait until you see what happens in the next one. I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.